A virgin, submissive and full of unbroken promises, she danced in the dark. He watched everything through the cameras night after night. Burning in silence, a dark desire grew between guilt, fear and attraction. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comments saying where you are watching from. In the Appalachian Mountains, where Virginia's peaks meet the sky in an eternal dance of mist and silence, the Reynolds mansion stands like a scar on the landscape. The neo-Gothic structure, with its pointed towers and arched windows that resemble empty eyes, dominates the 200-acre property like a monument to isolation. There, among century-old pine trees and gardens that long ago lost their original geometry, lives Ethan Reynolds, 42, heir to a pharmaceutical empire that extends throughout the nation. The Reynolds name is whispered in FDA corridors, in the boardrooms of the country's largest hospitals, and in laboratories where life and death are decided by molecules and patents. Ethan not only inherited the empire created by his father, but expanded it with a calculating coldness that made him one of the richest and most feared men in America. His decisions saved millions, but also condemned thousands, and one of those condemnations has a name and face: Lily Reynolds, his younger sister, who died at 17 during an experimental treatment that he himself authorized in a desperate attempt to cure her rare cancer. Since that March dawn 5 years ago, when the monitors stopped beeping in the private wing room of St. Raphael Hospital in New York, Ethan transformed into a ghost of himself. The mansion, which once hosted lavish parties and business meetings, became his voluntary prison. 32 rooms echo only his lonely footsteps, and the few employees who dare remain employed have learned to move like shadows, always avoiding crossing his path. What no one knows is that Ethan installed cameras in every corner of the property, not out of paranoia, but from a sick need for control that was born from the feeling of having lost control over the only thing that really mattered: Lily's life. From the dining room walls to the marble staircases, from endless corridors to outer gardens, everything is watched, recorded, archived. At night, he locks himself in his office and observes the screens like a lonely god contemplating an empty world. It's on a cold July morning that Mrs. Mitchell, from Mitchell Domestic Agency, calls to inform him that she has found a replacement for the last employee, who had quit after just 3 weeks of work. Like others before her, she left without explanations, only with the haunted look of someone who saw something they shouldn't have. Ethan accepts the new hire with his usual indifference, without even asking the name of the woman who would arrive the next day. Isabella Carter is 22 and brings with her only a worn leather suitcase and the silent determination of someone who learned early that life doesn't distribute favors. Raised by her aunts in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, after her mother's death from complications during the birth of a brother who didn't survive, she grew up between whispered prayers, Catholic guilt, and the promise made at her dying mother's bedside to remain pure, intact, until true love came into her life. It isn't naivety that keeps her a virgin, but an emotional resistance built brick by brick during years of religious indoctrination and fear of the world. Her aunts, Agnes and Sarah, 2 spinsters who dedicated their lives to caring for Holy Rosary Church, molded Isabella with sermons about the dangers of the flesh and the traps of men. But beneath this armor of chastity and silence beats a heart that doesn't know its own desires. The bus trip from Bethlehem to the Appalachian Mountains lasted 8 hours, and Isabella spent the entire time looking out the window, watching the world transform from plains to mountains, from simplicity to mystery. When the bus left her at the gate of the Reynolds mansion, she raised her eyes to the imposing construction and felt a shiver that she couldn't explain whether it was fear or expectation. The first meeting with Ethan lasted exactly 3 minutes. He descended the main staircase with the feline elegance of a predator, his black hair perfectly combed, his Italian suit impeccable despite it being only 10 in the morning. His green eyes, the color of a stormy sea, scanned Isabella from head to toe with a coldness that made her blush involuntarily. "You're the new employee," he said, not as a question but as a statement. His deep voice echoed through the entrance hall like distant thunder. "Follow the rules, remain invisible, don't enter locked rooms, and don't bother me unless the house is on fire. Liter ally." He turned on his heels and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Isabella alone with the echo of his footsteps and a strange sensation that she had just entered a golden cage. What she didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Ethan was already observing her through the cameras installed in the hall, and that something in her brown eyes, in the way she raised her chin defying discomfort, had awakened in him a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. The mansion revealed itself to be a labyrinth of memories and shadows. Isabella was assigned to care for the East Wing, which included the library, 2 visiting rooms that clearly hadn't received visitors in a long time, and an industrial kitchen that seemed to belong to a time when the house housed life. It was in this kitchen at the end of the first day that she discovered the old radio. The radio was covered in dust, forgotten on a high shelf among empty glass jars and utensils that seemed to have come from a museum. Isabella took it almost by instinct, cleaned it carefully and turned it on, more out of curiosity than any other reason. The initial static gave way to a melancholy waltz that seemed to float through the air like a musical ghost. It was a classical radio station from Boston, playing old music, Portuguese fados, and forgotten compositions that spoke of longing and unfulfilled desires. That first night, after finishing all the assigned tasks, Isabella found herself alone, in the kitchen illuminated only by the moon coming through the high windows. The music continued playing softly, and something primitive and inexplicable awakened inside her. It started slowly, just swaying her hips to the rhythm of the melody. Then, her arms rose, her feet slid across the cold stone floor, and she surrendered completely to the dance. Her movements were pure, instinctive, almost childlike in their spontaneity. There was no technique or choreography, just her body's urgent need to express everything her mind had repressed for years. Dance was her secret form of freedom, an escape valve for all the desires and dreams her aunts had taught her to suffocate. There, alone in the immensity of that kitchen, she was finally herself. What Isabella didn't know was that 3 floors above, in the mansion's private office, Ethan Reynolds had interrupted his nightly routine of reviewing financial reports to observe the monitoring screens. Initially, it was just peripheral movement that caught his attention. One of the kitchen cameras captured Isabella's delicate figure, and he leaned toward the screen with curiosity. In the first few minutes, he felt only that, curiosity. Then, as he watched her move with an unconscious and wild grace, curiosity transformed into something more dangerous, fascination. His eyes couldn't turn away from her image dancing, from her loose hair swaying to the rhythm of the silent music he couldn't hear, from the way she closed her eyes and surrendered completely to the moment. And then came the hunger. A hunger he hadn't felt in years, raw and urgent, which awakened. His body from an emotional hibernation he thought permanent. But along with desire came anger. Anger at himself for feeling something, for breaking the oath he had made on the day of Lily's funeral to never again allow himself any kind of emotional proximity with another human being. Anger at Isabella for awakening this in him without even knowing of his existence. During the second week, Ethan began to test Isabella's limits in subtle and cruel ways. He changed her routines, left impossible tasks, demanded that she clean his private office, the sanctuary where he kept all memories of Lily. He wanted to see her break, flee like the others. But Isabella didn't flee. Instead, she executed each task with a silent determination that both irritated and fascinated him in equal measure. In the office, she discovered Lily's photographs scattered across the mahogany desk, the framed medical diplomas, the still-sealed vials of experimental medicines. There was something deeply melancholic in that environment, a palpable sadness that permeated the air like perfume. Isabella cleaned each object with reverential care, as if instinctively understanding she was touching sacred relics of a pain she couldn't completely comprehend. It was during one of these cleanings that she found, half hidden behind a bookshelf, a red leather-bound diary with the initials LR engraved in gold. Curiosity was stronger than education, and she opened it to the first page. The small, delicate handwriting revealed the intimate thoughts of Lily Reynolds, her boss's dead sister. The first pages spoke of teenage dreams, plans for the future, admiration for the older brother who had become her personal hero. But as she advanced in reading, The tone changed drastically. Lily began to mention the treatments, the fear, the feeling of being used as a guinea pig by the very doctors she should trust. And then, in an entry dated 2 weeks before her death, she wrote about her nighttime dances in the kitchen and about the strange sensation of being watched. Isabella's heart raced. The words seemed to mirror exactly her own experience, as if Lily's death had left an echo that she unknowingly was repeating. She closed the diary with trembling hands and replaced it, but the suspicion had been planted. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, she didn't dance. She stood still, in the center of the kitchen, looking at the dark corners, looking for signs of invisible eyes that might be watching her. Paranoia grew in her chest like a poisonous plant, but she wasn't sure of anything. They were just suspicions, irrational fears born from reading a diary she perhaps shouldn't have touched. But Isabella was braver and more determined than she imagined. The next day, taking advantage that Ethan had left for a meeting in New York, she searched the office with scientific methodology. She looked through drawers, examined shelves, searched for anything that could confirm or dispel her suspicions. That's when she found, hidden in a folder on the last computer she checked, a series of video files organized by dates. Her own face appeared on the screen. Herself, dancing in the kitchen, filmed at angles that could only be captured by hidden cameras. There were files of each of her solitary nights, from the first to the most recent. Isabella watched a few minutes of herself moving on the screen, and the indignation she felt was so intense that for a moment she lost the ability to breathe. But instead of exploding, of screaming, of immediately confronting Ethan, she did something she didn't even expect. She swallowed the cry of rage, closed the files, turned off the computer, and waited. That night, when she returned to the kitchen, she turned on the radio as always, but this time she searched for the cameras until finding the almost imperceptible lens hidden among the utensils on the wall. And then, for the first time since, arriving at the mansion, Isabella danced looking directly at the camera, her brown eyes fixed on the lens with a challenging intensity. Her movements gained a conscious sensuality they didn't possess before. She had taken control of the silent narrative between them, and Ethan, on the other side of the screen, felt, for the first time in years, that he was losing control over something. The game had completely changed, and both knew it. In the following nights, Isabella's dances became a silent and dangerous conversation between her and the man she knew was on the other side of the cameras. Her movements gained a new consciousness, a calculated sensuality that made Ethan lean toward the screens with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She now danced as if telling a story. Sometimes she was provocative, slowly raising her arms and letting her blouse rise slightly, revealing the pale skin of her waist. Other times, she was melancholic, embracing her own body as if consoling an old pain. And in some moments, she fixed the camera with such a direct and challenging look that Ethan felt as if she could see him through the screen. During the day, they avoided each other with almost surgical precision. Isabella performed her tasks. At times, when she knew he would be in another wing of the house, and Ethan modified his routine to minimize any possibility of casual encounter. But the tension between them grew like an electrical storm, charging the mansion's air with an energy that even the other employees began to notice. It was Matthew Sanders, the property's gardener, who first noticed the change. At 40, an ex-convict, rehabilitated whom Ethan had hired 3 years ago on recommendation from a social program, Matthew possessed the acute sensitivity of someone who learned to read between the lines of life to survive. A man of few words and precise gestures, he took care of the mansion's gardens with the devotion of a monk tending a temple. In the 3rd week since Isabella's arrival, Matthew was pruning the rose bushes near the service wing when he heard music coming from the kitchen. Curiosity wasn't a luxury an ex-prisoner could afford, but something in the melancholy melody attracted him to the window. That's when he saw her for the first time. Isabella was dancing alone in the kitchen, illuminated by the moon, and for Matthew, it was like watching a miracle. Her movements had a purity that touched something deep in his soul, wounded by time and bitter prison experiences. She seemed like a lost angel in that place of shadows, a light he didn't know he needed to see. From that moment, Matthew began to organize his work to be near the kitchen during the nights. Not as a voyeur, but as a silent guardian. There was something about the Reynolds mansion that left him restless, a darkness that went beyond the Gothic architecture and poorly lit corridors. Isabella had awakened in him not only love, but a protective instinct he thought he had lost forever. The emotional triangle that formed was silent but intense. Ethan desired her with an obsession that grew each night, transforming into a hunger that threatened to devour what little sanity he still possessed. Matthew loved her with the reverential tenderness of someone who finds redemption in human form. And Isabella, at the center of this hurricane of emotions she didn't know, began to feel the weight of gazes she couldn't completely identify. The drastic change happened on a rainy Thursday in August. Ethan had spent 3 days in New York, resolving company issues, and returned to the mansion with an even darker mood than usual. During his absence, Isabella had danced every night, but her performances gained a melancholy he couldn't interpret. It was as if she missed something or someone. That night, after reviewing the files of the days he had missed, Ethan couldn't control himself. He went down to the kitchen for the first time in months, arriving silently while Isabella danced, with her back to the door. She wore a simple white cotton dress that floated around her legs like clouds, and her loose hair captured the moonlight coming through the windows. "You know I'm here," he said, and his deep voice echoed through the kitchen like thunder, making Isabella turn abruptly. The first real encounter between them happened under the silver light of dawn, surrounded by the silence of the sleeping house and the low music that continued coming from the old radio. Isabella faced him without fear, but with an intensity that surprised him. Her brown eyes seemed capable of seeing through all his defenses. "I always knew," she answered, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "Since the first night." Ethan approached slowly, like a predator that doesn't want to frighten the prey, but Isabella didn't back away. There was something magnetic between them, an attraction that went far beyond the physical. It was recognition. Two wounded souls that identified in pain, even without completely understanding the nature of that identification. "Why didn't you stop?" he asked, stopping a few inches from her. "Why did you continue dancing? Why didn't you stop watching?" She countered, raising her chin in a defiant gesture that made him smile for the first time in years. The smile completely transformed Ethan's face, revealing the man that existed beneath all that armor of coldness and control. Isabella felt something move inside her chest, an emotion she couldn't name but which made her take a step in his direction. "You remind me of someone," he murmured, raising his hand to touch her face, but stopping in the air, as if afraid of his own touch. "Your sister," said Isabella softly. "I found her diary." Ethan's hand froze in the air, and for a moment his face closed completely, returning to the cold mask of always. But this time, Isabella didn't allow him to hide. She held his wrist and guided his hand to her face, pressing his palm against her cheek. "I'm not her," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his. "And you're not the monster you think you are." The touch was electric, as if a current ran through both simultaneously. Ethan felt Isabella's soft skin under his palm, life pulsing there, warm and real. It was the first time in 5 years he touched another human being with affection, and the sensation was so intense that for a moment he completely lost control. He came even closer, their breaths mixing, their bodies almost touching. Isabella closed her eyes, waiting for the kiss she knew would come, desiring it despite all her fears and promises, but at the last second, Ethan abruptly backed away, as if he had been burned. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice hoarse with desire and fear. "You don't know who I really am." And then, without more words, he left the kitchen, leaving Isabella alone with her racing heart and a bitter taste of lost opportunity. That night, for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she couldn't dance. She stood still in the center of the kitchen, touching her face where she still felt the invisible mark of his hand, wondering if it had been real or just a cruel dream. Outside the window, Matthew watched everything with a broken heart. He had witnessed the encounter between Isabella and his boss, and immediately understood that his own feelings for her would never be reciprocated. But instead of bitterness, he felt only growing concern. He knew men like Ethan Reynolds, men consumed by inner demons that destroy everything they touch, and he wouldn't allow Isabella to be another victim. In the 3 days following the kitchen encounter, Ethan disappeared from the mansion like a ghost. The employees whispered that he had locked himself in the north wing, the oldest part of the property that no one had permission to access. Isabella continued executing her tasks with mechanical precision, but a part of her remained constantly alert, waiting for the sound of his footsteps on the marble corridors. Ethan's absence was almost palpable, as if the house itself missed his dark presence. The meals that Mrs. Carson, the cook who came 3 times a week, prepared remained untouched. The office lights remained off. Even the cameras seemed to have been turned off, as Isabella no longer felt the familiar weight of the invisible gaze during her daily activities. It was Matthew who broke the silence on a Friday morning when he found Isabella watering the plants in the solarium. She was distracted, lost in thoughts, and didn't notice his approach until he discreetly cleared his throat. "Sorry to bother you, miss," he said, removing his worn leather cap in a gesture of respect. "But I need to talk to you about something important." Isabella observed him with curiosity. Matthew was a man of few words, who generally communicated through respectful nods and shy smiles. His large, calloused hands held the cap nervously, and there was something in his eyes that immediately worried her. "What happened, Matthew?" she asked, putting the watering can aside. "It's about the boss," he said, looking around to make sure they were alone. "He's not well, miss. Last night, I heard screams coming from the north wing. And this morning, when I went to take care of the rose bushes near the windows there, I saw that he had broken several objects in his private office." Isabella's heart tightened. "What kind of objects?" "Portraits, miss. Many portraits of a young woman, and there was glass on the floor as if he had thrown something against the wall." Matthew hesitated before continuing. "It's none of my business, but you should be careful. Men like the boss, when they're hurt inside, sometimes hurt those nearby without meaning to." Matthew's words echoed in Isabella's mind all day. She knew little about Ethan Reynolds beyond the fragments she had managed to put together through the photographs in his office and the words written in Lily's diary. But there was something in the way he had touched her face in the kitchen, a vulnerability beneath all that controlled coldness, that made her believe there was goodness in him, buried under layers of guilt and isolation. That night, against all advice from her own prudence, Isabella decided to break the rules. After all the employees left and the mansion plunged into its habitual silence, she walked the corridors until reaching the north wing. The doors were all dark, heavy wood, with antique locks that seemed never to have been opened. But one of them at the end of the corridor was ajar. The weak light that leaked through the crack revealed an office in complete disorder. Books scattered across the floor, loose papers flying with the breeze that entered through the open window, and shards of glass shining like black diamonds on the Persian rug. In the center of the chaos, seated in a leather armchair with his head in his hands, was Ethan. He wasn't wearing his impeccable suit as usual. He wore only a wrinkled white shirt with the first buttons undone and dark pants that seemed to have been worn for days in a row. His black hair was disheveled, and there was an almost empty whiskey bottle on the table beside the armchair. "I said not to bother me," he murmured without raising his head, as if he instinctively knew she was there. "And I said I'm not your sister," answered Isabella, entering the office and closing the door behind her. Ethan raised his head abruptly, his green eyes bloodshot and wild, fixing on her with an intensity that should have been frightening. But Isabella didn't back away. Instead, she walked through the destroyed office, avoiding the glass shards, until stopping before the armchair where he sat. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice altered by alcohol and emotions he struggled to contain. "Answers," she said simply. "I want to know why a man who possesses everything money can buy lives like a prisoner in his own house. I want to know why you blame yourself for your sister's death. And I want to know why you kiss me with your eyes but flee when our bodies almost touch." Ethan laughed, but it was a bitter sound without any humor. "You really want to know? You want to know what kind of monster I am?" I already said you're not a monster. Lily was 17 when she developed a rare type of bone cancer. He began, his voice gaining a monotonous tone as if reciting medical facts. The doctors said she had 6 months to live, maybe less. I had just taken over the direction of the family pharmaceutical company and was developing an experimental treatment that could save her. He paused to take a sip of whiskey directly from the bottle, and Isabella noticed that his hands trembled slightly. She trusted me blindly, said I was her hero, that if anyone could save her, it was me. And I believed that. I really believed I could be her hero. His voice broke slightly on the word hero. The treatment was a complete failure. Not only did it not cure the cancer, but it accelerated its progression. She died in 3 weeks, in agony, begging me to stop the medications, and I continued, injecting her because I was desperate to prove I was right. The tears Isabella didn't know she was shedding ran down her face. The pain in Ethan's voice was so raw, so visceral, that she felt as if she were being cut from inside. She died hating me, he continued. In the last days, she didn't want to see me. She said I had become like the other doctors she feared, that I only saw her as an experiment, and she was right. No, said Isabella firmly. She was wrong. Ethan looked at her as if she had said something absurd. How can you be sure? Because I read her entire diary, revealed Isabella. Not just the parts about the treatment. I read everything from the beginning. And in the first pages she writes about you as if you were the most important person in the world to her. She talks about how you used to read stories to her when she was a child, about how you protected her from nightmares, about how it was you who taught her to dance. Ethan closed his eyes, as if her words were physically painful. She didn't die hating you, Ethan. She died frightened, confused, suffering. But deep in her heart, she knew that everything you did was out of love. How can you know that? Because she wrote it on the last page of the diary. A letter to you that she never had the courage to deliver. Isabella knelt beside the armchair, her hands lightly touching his knees. She apologizes for being cruel to you in the last days. She says she knew you were trying to save her, and that even if you hadn't succeeded, she loved you more than anything in the world. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ethan's heavy breathing. When he finally opened his eyes, they were full of tears he had repressed for 5 years. I killed her, he whispered. You tried to save her, corrected Isabella, her voice soft but determined. And even if you failed, that doesn't make you a murderer, it makes you human. For the first time since she entered the office, Ethan really saw her. Not as an employee, not as a substitute for his dead sister, but as Isabella. The woman who had danced for his cameras, who had faced his tests without backing down, who now knelt beside him offering forgiveness he didn't know how to accept. Why do you care? He asked, his hand moving instinctively to touch her face. Because I recognize pain when I see it, she answered, inclining her face against his palm. And because even not completely understanding what I feel for you, I know it's real. The moment that followed was suspended in time, as if the universe had decided to pause to allow 2 wounded souls to completely recognize each other. Ethan held Isabella's face between his hands, his thumbs tracing delicate lines over her cheeks wet with tears, and for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to feel something beyond the guilt that consumed him. You shouldn't be here, he murmured, but his words had no force of conviction. You shouldn't care about a man like me. But I do, she answered, her hands covering his, and I'm here of my own free will. The kiss that happened was as inevitable as gravity. It began soft, almost hesitant, as if both were afraid of breaking something fragile and precious. But, as their lips met and recognized each other, hesitation gave way to an urgency that surprised them both. It was hunger from 5 years of solitude on one side, and 22 years of repression on the other. Ethan pulled her to his lap in the leather armchair, and she fit against him as if she had been made for that space. Her hands explored his, broad shoulders beneath his wrinkled shirt, feeling the tension of muscles that relaxed under her touch. He buried his fingers in her hair, undoing the simple bun she wore during work, and letting the brown strands fall like a curtain around them. But it was when his hands found the curve of her waist beneath her blouse that Isabella involuntarily stiffened. The promise made at her dying mother's bedside echoed in her mind like an alarm bell, and she abruptly moved away, breathing heavily. "I can't," she whispered, her eyes reflecting an internal conflict that Ethan immediately recognized. "Why? Not?" he asked, but there was no pressure in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Isabella rose from his lap and walked to the window, embracing her own body as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. "I made a promise when my mother died. I promised I would keep myself pure until finding true love. And you don't believe this is love?" Ethan's question was made with a vulnerability she had never heard in any man's voice. "I don't know what love is," she confessed, turning to face him. "I only know that when I'm near you, I feel as if I'm burning inside. And that scares me more than anything I've ever felt." Ethan rose from the armchair and walked to her, but stopped at a respectful distance. "Then we'll wait," he said simply. "Wait for what?" "For the moment when you know with certainty. For the moment when it's not fear or old promises that govern your choices, but what you truly desire." He extended his hand to her. "Meanwhile, allow me to know you, really, not as boss and employee, but as Ethan and Isabella." Isabella's hand trembled slightly when it intertwined with his, but it was a tremor of anticipation, not fear. That night, they talked until dawn. Ethan told about his lonely childhood in a house full of employees, but empty of affection, about the pressure of taking over a pharmaceutical empire at 25, about how Lily had been the only person in the world who loved him without expecting anything in return. Isabella spoke about growing up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, about the religious aunts who had molded her consciousness with guilt and fear, about the mother who died too young, and the brother who never had a chance to live. She told about her secret dreams of one day traveling the world, of knowing other cultures, of dancing on real stages instead of empty kitchens. As the days passed, a new routine established itself at the Reynolds mansion. During the day, Isabella continued executing her tasks, but now Ethan found excuses to be in the same environments as her. They talked while she cleaned the library, he helped her water the plants in the solarium, and together they reorganized the office he had destroyed. On the night of anger, the nights became sacred. After the other employees left, they met in the kitchen, but now there were no hidden cameras. Ethan had turned off the entire surveillance system of the house, a symbolic gesture of trust that didn't go unnoticed by Isabella. She danced for him, but this time, not alone. Ethan joined her, initially awkward, but gradually finding the rhythm. "Your sister taught you well," said Isabella on one of those nights, laughing as he clumsily spun her to the sound of a tango playing on the old radio. "Lily was the dancer." "In the family," he answered, pulling her closer. "I was always better with numbers than with movements." "Lie," she countered, allowing him to dip her in an improvised dance. "You move like a predator when you want. I saw that on the first day." The intimacy between them grew like a plant that finally finds the sun after a long time in the shade. They were casual touches during the day, hands that intertwined during walks through the garden, stolen kisses in empty corridors. Ethan respected Isabella's limits, but his patience was tested every night when she nestled in his arms on the library sofa and he felt her breath against his neck. It was Matthew who first noticed the change in his boss. The dark and controlled man he had known for 3 years had been replaced by someone who whistled while walking through the gardens, who smiled when greeting employees, who seemed to have found a reason to live again. And although his heart tightened to see Isabella in another man's arms, Matthew couldn't deny that she seemed truly happy. But happiness, Matthew knew from personal experience, was something fragile that could be easily destroyed. And there were signs that storms approached the Reynolds mansion. The first sign arrived on a Tuesday morning, in the form of an elegant letter delivered by a private messenger. Isabella received it at the main door, finding it strange that it was addressed to her by her full name, Miss Isabella Carter Monroe. The surname Monroe wasn't part of the name she used at work, and no one at the mansion knew of its existence. The letter was from a law office in New York. informing that she had been located as the sole living heir of Elizabeth Monroe Everett, a great-grandmother she didn't even know existed. The woman had died recently in Scotland, leaving a considerable property and an inheritance that would completely change Isabella's financial situation. The second sign arrived 3 days later, in the form of an unexpected visit. Isabella was arranging flowers in the main hall when the doorbell rang. Upon opening the door, she found an elegant man of about 50, perfectly combed grey hair and a suit that cost more than she earned in 6 months. "Miss Carter?" he asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Austin Reynolds. I'm Ethan's cousin, and I've come to talk to you about a matter of extreme importance." The third sign was the most disturbing of all. That same night, while Isabella and Ethan danced in the kitchen, she told him about his cousin's visit and about the unexpected inheritance. She expected to see joy in Ethan's eyes, happiness for the fact that she had found a chance for financial independence. Instead, she saw fear. "Austin was here?" he asked, abruptly stopping dancing. "Yes. He said he wanted to talk about something important, but I explained that you don't receive visits." Ethan ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of nervousness she had already learned to recognize. "Isabella, I need to tell you something about my family, about why I live isolated like this." But before he could continue, the sound of glass shattering came from the direction of the dining room. Someone had broken one of the huge windows that opened to the garden. Ethan pushed Isabella behind the kitchen table and went to investigate, returning minutes later with a pale face. "We have to leave here," he said, taking the car keys. "Now. What's happening?" "My family discovered about you," he answered, helping her put on her coat. "And they'll do anything to keep me isolated. And controllable. Anything, Isabella, even hurting you." As they fled the mansion in the cold dawn, with the car headlights cutting through the darkness of the winding road, Isabella understood that the simple life she had known had come to an end. From that moment, she would be at the center of she didn't completely understand, but from which she could no longer escape. The wooden cabin hidden in the mountains of Aspen seemed taken from a dark fairy tale. Ethan had driven for 3 hours through winding roads, always checking the rearview mirror for cars that might be following them, until reaching that isolated property he had kept secret for years. It was his final refuge, the place where he had planned to hide if someday his family decided he had become a bigger problem than an asset. Isabella observed the rustic construction surrounded by pine trees and a mist that seemed never to completely dissipate. There was something comforting about that place, a sensation of protection that contrasted drastically with the imposing and cold architecture of the Reynolds mansion. Here, finally, she could breathe. "How long can we stay here?" she asked, as Ethan unlocked the entrance door. "As long as necessary," he answered, but there was a tension in his voice that suggested that perhaps it wouldn't be as long as they would like. "I need to explain what's happening, what you got involved in by getting involved with me." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly cozy. Rustic wooden furniture, a stone fireplace that dominated the main room, and wide windows that offered a stunning view of the mountains covered in green. Ethan lit the fire while Isabella prepared coffee in the small but well-equipped kitchen, and for the first time since they had fled the mansion, the two managed to relax minimally. "The Reynolds family isn't just rich," began Ethan when they finally sat before the crackling fire. "We're dangerous. My great-grandfather built the pharmaceutical empire using methods that today would be considered criminal: illegal tests in vulnerable communities, bribery of health authorities, elimination of competitors by means that went far beyond commercial competition." Isabella held the coffee cup more tightly, feeling the heat spreading through her palms. "And this continues happening?" "My father tried to clean up the company when he took control, but discovered that leaving the world of shadows isn't as simple as entering it. There are agreements, blackmail, secrets that keep the entire structure standing. When he died in a suspicious car accident, I inherited not only the company, but all the skeletons that came with it. That's why you live isolated." "Partially, but mainly because I discovered documents that prove Lily wasn't the family's first guinea pig. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my own father, all used family members as test subjects for experimental treatments." Lily was just the most recent in a long lineage of scientific accidents. The horror in Ethan's voice made Isabella rise from the sofa and kneel before him, her hands covering his. "You're not like them. But I'm heir to all this. And while I'm alive and controlling the company, I'm a threat to the other family members who prefer the old methods. Austin, my cousin, is the unofficial leader of that faction. He wants me to be declared mentally incapable so he can take control of Reynolds Pharmaceuticals. And how do I fit into this?" Ethan hesitated, his green eyes reflecting the flames of the fireplace. "You became my weakness. They know I'll do anything to protect you, including voluntarily handing over control of the company." The revelation hit Isabella like a punch to the stomach. "So I'm just a piece in a game I don't understand?" "No," he said firmly, holding her face between his hands. "You're the only real thing that has happened in my life in the last 5 years. The only reason I want to continue fighting, instead of simply giving up everything." They spent the next 3 days in the cabin living in a forced bubble of intimacy that brought them closer in ways they never imagined possible. Without employees, without rigid routines, without the pressures of the outside world, they could truly know each other. Ethan cooked for her, something he hadn't done since adolescence, and Isabella discovered that he had a dry and intelligent sense of humor that he rarely showed to the world. The nights were the most challenging. They slept in the same bed out of necessity. The cabin had only one bedroom, but maintained a respectful distance that became more difficult to sustain. With each dawn, Isabella woke up in Ethan's arms, and he awakened with her hair tickling his neck, and both pretended that that proximity didn't deeply affect them. It was on the third night that the tension finally exploded. A storm had cut the electrical power, and they were lying in the dark, listening to the rain hit against the windows with a fury that seemed to mirror what they felt inside. "Isabella," murmured Ethan in the darkness, his voice hoarse with contained desire. "I know," she whispered back, turning to face him even though she couldn't see him completely. "I can't continue pretending I don't desire you." "Then stop pretending." What happened next was a slow and careful dance of mutual discovery, hands that explored forbidden territories, overclothes that gradually became unnecessary obstacles, kisses that began soft and transformed into a hunger that threatened to consume them whole. Ethan touched every inch of skin she allowed, and Isabella discovered that her body was capable of sensations she had never imagined existed. But when they reached the final threshold, when there were no more barriers between them except the old promise she carried, Isabella again froze. "I want to," she said, her words broken by heavy breathing. "I want it so much that it's hurting me inside, but you need to be sure," completed Ethan, softly kissing her forehead. "You need to be sure it's love, and not just desire." "How can I be sure if I've never felt this before?" "Close." "Your eyes?" he asked, pulling her to nestle against his chest. "Imagine that tomorrow you wake up and discover that I've disappeared from your life forever. How do you feel?" Isabella closed her eyes and really considered the possibility. The pain she imagined was so intense that she involuntarily sobbed. "As if a part of me had been torn away," she admitted. "Now imagine that you discovered I was lying about everything, that I never really cared about you, that you were just a temporary diversion." This time, beyond pain, she felt anger, a fierce and protective anger that surprised her. "I would kill you," she said, half laughing, half crying. "And now imagine that I'm sick, dying, and you can save me. But it would mean sacrificing your own life." There was no hesitation. "I would do it." "Then you already know," said Ethan, kissing the top of her head. "You already know what you feel for me." The next morning, they were awakened by the sound of cars approaching on the dirt road. Ethan rose immediately, looking out the window, with an expression that mixed resignation and determination. "They found us," he said, quickly starting to dress. Isabella rose too, her heart racing. "What do we do?" "You take your great-grandmother's inheritance and disappear, change your name, leave the country, build a new life far from all this. And you?" "I face my family and end this once and for all." "No," said Isabella firmly. "I won't abandon you now." "Isabella, no," she repeated stronger. "You said I'm your weakness, but you're wrong. I'm your strength. And together we're stronger than any of them alone. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted them. A familiar voice shouted from outside, "Ethan, we know you're in there. Come out and bring the girl. We have a civilized proposal to make." It was Austin Reynolds, and from the tone of his voice it was clear the proposal would be anything but civilized. Ethan took a revolver he kept hidden in a dresser drawer, checked if it was loaded, and looked at Isabella with an intensity she would never forget. "If anything happens to me," he said, "promise you'll live, that you'll be happy, that you'll dance on real stages like you always dreamed." "I promise," she said, "if you promise you'll fight for us, that you won't give up on what we have." He kissed her one last time, a kiss that tasted of farewell, and promise at the same time. Before opening the cabin door and going out to face the demons of the family he had spent his life trying to avoid. The cold Aspen morning transformed into a western scene when Ethan left the cabin with his hands raised, but with the revolver still visible in his waistband. 5 black cars were parked in a semicircle before the property, and at least 10 men, in dark suits, positioned themselves strategically around the house. In the center of them all, Austin Reynolds adjusted his shirt cuffs with the calmness of someone executing a carefully elaborated plan. "Dear cousin," said Austin with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you look terrible. When was the last time you slept properly? Cut this act, Austin. What do you want?" "We want what we've always wanted, for you to be reasonable." Austin signaled to 2 of his men who approached cautiously. "The company is suffering from your emotional instability. The investors are worried. The board is losing confidence. The company is doing better than ever, and you know it." "Ah, yes, but financial stability isn't the same thing as mental stability, don't you agree?" Austin took a set of papers from the inside pocket of his suit. "I have here reports from 3 independent psychiatrists attesting that you've developed paranoid tendencies, obsessive behavior, and detachment from reality, symptoms that intensified drastically in the last few weeks." Ethan knew it was a farce, but he also knew that in the business world, perception was more powerful than reality. "And what is your proposal?" "Simple. You voluntarily sign the papers, transferring executive control of the company to me. Commit yourself to a discreet psychiatric clinic in Switzerland for an indefinite period, and we guarantee that Miss Carter won't suffer any unfortunate accident." The veiled threat made Ethan's blood boil, but he kept his voice controlled. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be forced to commit yourself anyway, but this time through a court order based on these medical reports." "And your protégé? Well, accidents happen very frequently to people who meddle in matters they don't understand." At that moment, Isabella appeared at the cabin door. She had quickly dressed in jeans and a wool blouse, but her hair was still messy from sleep, and there was a determination in her eyes that Ethan immediately recognized as dangerous. "Miss Carter," said Austin with exaggerated courtesy, "good to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you." "I can't say the same," answered Isabella, descending the porch steps to stand beside Ethan, "but from what I've heard, you're the type of man who hides behind lawyers and false documents." Austin's smile faltered slightly. "Be careful with your words, miss. Defamation is a crime." "Blackmail and coercion are too," she countered. "And I'm sure there are recorders turned on in at least 3 cars here." It was a bluff, but it worked. Austin instinctively looked at the cars, and in that moment of distraction, Ethan noticed something that completely changed his strategy. One of Austin's men had positioned himself very close to the bedroom window, in a position that would allow a clean shot if necessary. They weren't there just for psychological pressure. They were prepared to use violence if the negotiation failed. "Isabella," he said softly, without taking his eyes off Austin, "go back inside." "No. Go back inside. Now." "I said no." She took a step forward, placing herself partially between Ethan and Austin's men. "Anything you want to do to him, you'll have to do to me too." Austin laughed, but there was a note of genuine irritation in his voice. "How romantic. But do you really believe a 2-week love is worth more than $1 billion empire?" "It is," said Isabella without hesitating, "because one is real and the other is built on lies and blood." It was then that everything quickly unraveled. One of Austin's men moved to flank Ethan, who instinctively pulled the revolver. The movement triggered a chain reaction, with 3 more guns being drawn. But before any shot could be fired, the sound of sirens cut through the morning air. 3 Colorado State Police patrol cars appeared on the road, followed by an unmarked car. Austin cursed softly, clearly not expecting this intervention. The first officer to exit the car was a middle-aged detective whom Ethan vaguely recognized from some official ceremony. "Detective Cardenas, Colorado State Police," the man announced, showing his badge. "We received an anonymous report about kidnapping and false imprisonment. Everyone lower your weapons." "There's some mistake, Detective," said Austin, quickly recovering his composure. "We're just in a family meeting to resolve business issues. In an isolated property with 10 armed men at 6 in the morning?" The detective didn't seem convinced. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, addressing Ethan, "are you here of your own free will?" "Yes, Detective." "And the lady?" "Also," answered Isabella. "Well, then there's no crime here, but I'll have to ask everyone to put away their weapons and leave peacefully." Austin knew when he was defeated. He made a gesture to his men, who holstered their pistols and began heading to the cars. But before leaving, he approached Ethan with an expression that promised this was far from over. "This doesn't end here, cousin. You may have won this battle, but the war is just beginning. And now you've involved an innocent in something that can destroy her." After all the cars left and the officers made their routine notes, Detective Cardenas approached Ethan with a serious expression. "Mr. Reynolds, can I speak with you in private?" They walked to the backyard, far enough that Isabella couldn't hear. "The report wasn't anonymous," said the detective. "It was made by an employee of your property, a gardener named Matthew Sanders. He said he overheard a telephone conversation between 2 men planning to kidnap you both and force you to sign documents." Ethan's heart warmed at Matthew's. Unexpected loyalty. "Is he okay?" "He's hidden in a safe house we provided. But Mr. Reynolds, I need to be honest with you. We can't protect you indefinitely. Your family has resources and connections that go far beyond what the police can legally confront." "I know." "What do you intend to do?" Ethan looked back at the cabin where Isabella stood on the porch, watching them with concern. "I'm going to do what I should have done 5 years ago. I'm going to confront my family on their own terms." "That's dangerous." "More dangerous is letting this continue. They'll never stop as long as I'm a threat to their control. And now that they have a way to blackmail me through Isabella, things will only get worse." That afternoon, after the police left and they were alone again in the cabin, Ethan told Isabella about his decision. She listened in silence, seated beside him on the sofa before the unlit fireplace, their hands intertwined. "I'll return to New York," he said. "I'll gather all the evidence I have about the family's crimes, including Lily's death, and deliver everything to the FBI and the press simultaneously. If they want to destroy me, I'll make sure they fall with me." "And us?" "There is no us in this plan, Isabella. You'll take your great-grandmother's inheritance and start over far from here. You'll be free to live without you." She rose from the sofa, her eyes shining with tears of anger. "You still don't understand, do you? I don't want to be free from you. I want to be free with you." "Isabella, no, Ethan, this time you're going to listen to me." She knelt before him, exactly as she had done on the first night they met in the mansion's kitchen. "I love you, completely, desperately, without reservations. And when you truly love someone, you don't abandon that person at the first difficulty. You don't understand the risks. I understand better than you imagine, but I also understand that a life without you isn't a life I want to live." She held his face between her hands. "So stop trying to protect me by making decisions for me. We're partners now. We face this together, or we don't face it." That night, for the first time since they met, they made love for real. There was no hesitation, no old promises to break. There were only 2 hearts that finally completely recognized each other, 2 bodies that surrendered without reservations, and 2 souls that decided they preferred to face the world together than to live apart in safety. At dawn, as they dressed, To return to battle, Isabella danced one last time in the cabin. But this time she wasn't alone, and it wasn't a dance of solitude or seduction. It was a dance of celebration, of union, of two people who had found in love the courage to face any storm. New York received Ethan and Isabella with its characteristic urban coldness of September. The apartment that Ethan secretly maintained in the East Village was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Reynolds mansion, a small, functional space completely devoid of ostentation. 2 bedrooms, a living room integrated with the kitchen, and windows that faced an internal courtyard where the sun arrived only a few hours a day. It was the type of place where a man could disappear if necessary. During the first 48 hours, they worked like corporate crime investigators. Ethan had brought from the mansion all the documents he could carry, digital files secretly copied over years, old correspondence between family members, medical reports of experimental treatments dating back to the 1960s. Isabella revealed herself surprisingly skilled at organizing information, categorizing evidence with a precision that impressed even Ethan. "You should have studied law instead of working as a housekeeper," he commented on one of those afternoons, seeing her create a detailed mapping of family connections and their respective participations in the documented crimes. "Maybe I still will," she answered, without taking her eyes from the papers. "When all this is over, I intend to do many things I never had the opportunity to do." The first victory came when they managed to contact Dr. Helena Vega, an investigative journalist from the New York Times specialized in corporate crimes. She agreed to meet with them at a discreet cafe in Greenwich Village, and when Ethan began to show the evidence, her eyes lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. "This is a bomb," she said, quickly leafing through some of the most compromising documents. "If we can authenticate all this, it will be the pharmaceutical scandal of the decade in America. How long do you need to verify everything?" "A week, maybe 2, but I'll need protection for both of you. If your family discovers you're collaborating with the press—" "They already know we're planning something," interrupted Isabella. "The question is when they'll decide they can't wait any longer." The answer came 2 days later, in a way none of them expected. Isabella was shopping at the market near the apartment when she noticed she was being followed. It was a middle-aged man, discreet, who appeared to be just doing his own shopping, but who coincidentally was in all the aisles she visited. Instead of returning directly home, she made several turns around the neighborhood, confirmed she was indeed being followed, and then did something that surprised even herself. She entered a pharmacy, bought a disposable phone, and called Ethan. "I'm being followed," she said, speaking softly while pretending to examine products on the shelves. "A man with gray hair, brown leather jacket. Leave wherever you are and go to Midtown Mall. Enter through the main entrance, go up to the 3rd floor and wait for me in the food court. I'll be there in 20 minutes. What if he follows me there?" "Better. Public places with lots of people are safer than empty streets." What neither of them expected was that when Isabella arrived at the mall, she found not only the man who was following her, but also 3 others who clearly were part of the same operation. And waiting for her in the food court, with a cordial smile and a coffee already ordered, was Austin Reynolds. "Miss Carter," he said, gesturing for her to sit at the table. "What a pleasant surprise. May I buy you a coffee?" Isabella quickly evaluated her options. Running would be useless, she was surrounded. Screaming would attract attention, but could also escalate the situation dangerously. She decided to sit and play his game at least until Ethan arrived. "Thank you, but I don't drink coffee in the afternoon," she said, keeping her voice firm. "Ah, of course. How careless of me. You prefer tea, don't you? Chamomile tea with honey? If I'm not mistaken." The fact that he knew her personal preferences was a deliberate psychological blow. Austin wanted to make it clear that he knew much more about her than should be possible. "What do you want?" "I want to talk with an intelligent young woman about the choices she's making. You know my cousin isn't a stable man, don't you? You know he was responsible for his own sister's death?" "I know he tried to save her and failed. That doesn't make him a murderer." "No? And what about the other patients who died during the tests of medications he approved? What about the entire communities that were poisoned by defective medicines he authorized to cut costs?" Isabella felt a chill in her stomach. You're lying. Am I? Austin took a tablet from the document holder beside the chair and slid it across the table to her. These are FDA reports that were buried for years, dozens of deaths that can be directly attributed to decisions Ethan made as CEO. The images and reports on the screen were genuine, she could tell, but there was something in the way Austin presented them that made her suspicious. Why are you showing me this? If Ethan were really dangerous, you wouldn't be trying to take control of the company, you'd be trying to destroy it. Austin smiled, but for the first time since she had known him, the smile seemed genuine. You're smarter than I imagined. Smart enough to know that you manipulated this information? The deaths may be real, but I bet they were caused by decisions that your faction of the family forced Ethan to make, weren't they? Intelligent and intuitive, I can see why my cousin fell in love with you. Austin leaned back in the chair, completely changing tactics. Very well. I'll be honest with you, Miss Carter. Ethan really isn't a murderer. He is, in fact, excessively moral for the type of business he inherited, and that's exactly why he needs to be removed. Because he doesn't want to participate in the family's crimes anymore. Because he's destroying decades of lucrative relationships with his guilty conscience. Reynolds Pharmaceuticals provides vital medications for hundreds of thousands of people in America and Latin America. If he continues exposing the schemes of the past, the company will go bankrupt, and those people will be left without access to the treatments that maintain their lives. It was a sophisticated argument, and Isabella perceived that there was a grain of truth in it, but she also perceived the manipulation. And you think by blackmailing him through me you'll get him to collaborate? I thought so. But now I see that you're not just a vulnerability of his. You're a partner, and partners are much more dangerous than vulnerabilities. It was at that moment that Ethan arrived at the food court. He immediately saw the scene, Isabella seated with his cousin, the men strategically positioned around, and his expression hardened. Austin, he said, approaching the table, I hope you're not bothering my girlfriend. On the contrary, cousin. We were having a fascinating conversation about business morality and the complexities of commanding a multinational pharmaceutical company. Ethan sat beside Isabella, instinctively placing himself between her and Austin. And did you reach any conclusion? We did, said Isabella, surprising both men. We reached the conclusion that you have 24 hours to voluntarily step away from the company, or more drastic measures will be taken. Austin blinked, clearly not expecting her to summarize the situation so directly. The lady is very direct. I learned that circumlocutions are dangerous when dealing with people like you. Isabella rose from the chair. So I'll be equally direct. We have sufficient evidence to destroy not only you, but the entire criminal structure your family built over decades. And if anything happens to us, that evidence will automatically be delivered to the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and 3 different media outlets. It wasn't true. They hadn't yet implemented that type of security system, but it sounded convincing enough to make Austin hesitate. You're bluffing. Are we? Ethan rose too, holding Isabella's hand. There's only one way to find out. They left the mall walking calmly, like a normal couple shopping on any afternoon, but both knew they had just officially declared war on the Reynolds family, and that the consequences wouldn't be long in coming. That night, as they made love in the small apartment, there was a different urgency in their touches. It wasn't just desire, but also the awareness that they might not have many other nights like that. Tomorrow, the final battle would begin for real. Thursday morning brought the first sign that Austin wasn't bluffing. Ethan woke to the sound of the phone ringing insistently, and when he answered, he recognized Detective Cardenas's tense voice. Mr. Reynolds, I need to speak with you immediately. Can you meet me at the East Village precinct in 1 hour? Did something happen? Your employee, Matthew Sanders. He was found dead in a motel in Queens. Apparently cocaine overdose, but there are inconsistencies in the scene. Ethan's blood froze. Matthew had never used drugs. It was a matter of principle for him, formed during his years in prison. They killed him. I can't officially confirm that, but I suggest you take extra precautions And Mr. Reynolds, maybe it's time to accelerate whatever plans you have." Isabella woke when she heard Ethan finish the call, and it was enough to look at his expression to understand that something terrible had happened. When he told her about Matthew, she felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The gentle man who had silently protected her, who had risked everything to alert the police about the kidnapping plan, was dead because of them. "It's my fault," she whispered, tears running down her face. "If I hadn't gotten involved with you, he would still be alive." "No," said Ethan firmly, pulling her into his arms. "The fault is mine, for having allowed this to reach this point, for having believed I could protect all of you by keeping my distance." They spent the morning in the apartment, completely reformulating their plans. Matthew's death wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. Austin was sending a clear message. No one who supported them would be safe. That's when Isabella had an idea that would change everything. "What if we didn't wait for the journalist to authenticate the evidence?" she asked, organizing the documents scattered across the living room table. "What if we disclosed everything today? Without authentication, they can claim their falsifications. They can try. But you're the CEO of the company. Your word has weight. And if we do this publicly, they won't have time to prepare a coordinated defense." Ethan looked at her with growing admiration. "You're suggesting a press conference?" "I'm suggesting more than that. I'm suggesting that we summon not only the press, but also representatives from the FDA, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, and human rights organizations. That we do this in the auditorium of Reynolds Pharmaceuticals itself, using the company's resources to expose the company's crimes." It was audacious to the point of seeming crazy, but it had a perverse logic that Ethan immediately recognized. They wouldn't expect something so direct. Exactly, and once everything is publicly exposed, killing both of you would be useless. The damage would already be done. They spent the next 6 hours in intensive planning. Ethan used his authority as CEO to summon a corporate transparency meeting for 5 in the afternoon, sending invitations to dozens of journalists, authorities, and NGO representatives. Isabella prepared an executive summary of the documented crimes, organizing the evidence so that it could be clearly presented in less than an hour. At 3 in the afternoon, when they left the apartment to head to the company's headquarters, they knew they were walking straight into a trap, but they also knew it was the only way to end the situation definitively. The Reynolds Pharmaceuticals building dominated an entire block in the financial center of New York, its 22 floors of glass and steel reflecting the gray afternoon sky. When they arrived at the main lobby, Ethan immediately noticed there were more security guards than normal, and that several familiar faces from the family were present, distant cousins, uncles, people who rarely appeared at the company. "I know," he murmured to Isabella as they headed to the elevators. "Let them know," she answered, squeezing his hand. "We've already come too far to back down." The company's auditorium on the 15th floor was packed when they arrived. Ethan recognized journalists from at least 6 different outlets, government representatives, and various personalities from the pharmaceutical sector he had invited to give credibility to the event. But he also saw Austin and at least 10 other members of the Reynolds family scattered throughout the audience. When Ethan went up on stage, the silence was absolute. Everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing through the sound system, "I summoned you here today to make revelations about criminal practices that have been happening in the American pharmaceutical industry for more than 60 years. Practices in which my own family not only participated, but led." A murmur ran through the audience. Ethan looked at Isabella, who was seated in the first row, and found in her the strength to continue. For decades, Reynolds Pharmaceuticals tested experimental medications on vulnerable populations, bribed government officials to accelerate approvals, and eliminated competitors through methods that included industrial sabotage and, in some cases, murder. The murmur transformed into muffled exclamations. Several cameras began recording, and Ethan saw journalists taking notes furiously. "Have in my possession documents that prove all this. Signed contracts, payment orders, falsified medical reports, correspondence between family members discussing the elimination of human obstacles to our plans. That's when Austin rose from his chair. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform that my cousin is going through a severe mental collapse. The documents he mentions are falsifications created during a psychotic episode." Two people wearing medical coats entered the auditorium through the side doors, and Ethan immediately realized what was happening. It was a forced commitment, disguised as an emergency medical intervention. "Mr. Reynolds," said one of the doctors coming up on stage, "I'm Dr. Richard Silver, psychiatrist. Your family contacted us concerned about your mental state. I need you to come with us voluntarily for an evaluation." It was the moment they had predicted. Isabella rose from her chair and walked to the stage, surprising everyone. "Before taking Mr. Reynolds," she said, taking the microphone from his hands, "I'd like to present to the authorities present this evidence." She opened the folder she had brought and began distributing copies of the most compromising documents directly to the representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI who were in the audience. "Including," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "the recording of a telephone conversation between Austin Reynolds and a professional killer discussing the murder of Matthew Sanders, a company employee who was found dead yesterday." The auditorium exploded in confusion. There was no such recording. It was another desperate bluff, but it was enough for the prosecutors present to rise and begin making demands for clarification. In the midst of the chaos, two security guards approached Isabella, clearly following Austin's orders to remove her from the stage. But before they could touch her, Ethan placed himself between them and her, and for the first time in 5 years, he allowed all his repressed anger to come to the surface. "If anyone lays a finger on her," he said, his voice low but carrying a threat that made the security guards hesitate, "I will make public every bank transaction, every murder, every crime this family has committed since 1960. And I'll do it in such a spectacular way that you'll spend the rest of your life hiding in holes." It was then that the FBI representative rose and made the announcement that would change everything. "Based on the evidence presented here, we are formally initiating an investigation into the activities of Reynolds Pharmaceuticals. No one leaves this building until we have statements from everyone present." Austin immediately understood that he had lost. The plan to forcibly commit Ethan had failed, the evidence was now in official hands, and trying to use violence in a room full of authorities and journalists would be political and legal suicide. But he had one last card to play. "Very well, cousin," he said, approaching the stage. "You won this battle, but before you feel too victorious, there's something you need to know about your little girlfriend." Ethan felt Isabella stiffen beside him. "What do you mean?" "Ask her about the inheritance she received. Ask her about who her great-grandmother really was, and ask her if it's just a coincidence that a descendant of Elizabeth Monroe Everett appeared in your life, exactly when our family needed a way to control you." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan looked at Isabella, searching for denial in her eyes, but found only guilt and fear. The silence in the auditorium was broken only by the sound of cameras clicking and journalists whispering among themselves. Ethan looked at Isabella as if seeing her for the first time, and she felt her heart break apart as she recognized the betrayal in his green eyes. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice carrying a pain she had never heard before. "Is it true?" She opened her mouth to deny, to explain, to say anything that could undo the poison Austin had planted between them, but the words didn't come. How could she explain that, yes, there were lies in her story, but not the lies Austin was insinuating? "Answer." "Him, Miss Carter," pressed Austin, savoring every moment of the drama that was unfolding. "Tell him about how your great-grandmother, Elizabeth Monroe Everett, was a private nurse for the Reynolds family patriarch in the 1940s. Tell him about how she became pregnant by him and was expelled from the family with an amount sufficient to buy silence. Tell him about how our family always knew of the existence of her descendants." Isabella's legs weakened, and she had to lean on the podium to avoid falling. The story Austin was telling was true, but incomplete. Yes, she had discovered, about Elizabeth in the inheritance documents. Yes, she had realized the connection with the Reynolds, but not in the way he was painting it. "You knew," said Ethan, his voice transforming into a cold accusation. "From the beginning, you knew who I was." "No," she managed to say, finally finding her voice. "Not in the way you're thinking." "Then in what way?" The entire audience was watching the personal drama unfold publicly, but at that moment, Isabella could only see Ethan, could only see the pain and distrust growing in his eyes, destroying everything they had built together. "I discovered about Elizabeth only after I received the inheritance," she said, her words coming out quick and desperate. "And yes, when I read the documents, I understood that she had worked for your family. But when I arrived at the mansion, I didn't know you were my boss. The agency only told me the surname. But you didn't tell me when you discovered." "No, I didn't tell you." Tears began to run down Isabella's face. "Because I was afraid you would think exactly what you're thinking now, that I had approached you with ulterior motives." Austin laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the silent auditorium. "What a touching performance, but tell him about the meetings you had with our lawyers before accepting the job at the mansion." Ethan's heart stopped. "What meetings?" Isabella closed her eyes, knowing that anything she said now would be used against her. "They sought me out in Bethlehem 3 days before I came to the mansion. They said they knew about the inheritance, about my connection to the family. They offered to pay me to report your activities." The auditorium exploded in murmurs, but Ethan remained in absolute silence, processing the information. "But I refused," continued Isabella, her voice breaking. "I told them I wasn't interested in espionage or blackmail, that I only wanted an honest job." "And even so, you accepted working at the mansion?" "Yes, because I needed the job, and because—" She hesitated, knowing that her next words would determine the fate of both. "And because I was curious about you, about the man my great-grandmother had loved so much that she kept secrets about him until death." It was then that everything began to make sense to Ethan. The pieces fit together. The way she had reacted to Lily's photographs, the way she seemed to instinctively understand his pain, the ease with which she had found the hidden diary. "You were investigating me." "In the beginning, yes, but not for the reasons you're thinking." Isabella approached him, completely ignoring the audience watching them. "I was investigating because I wanted to understand why a woman like my great-grandmother had loved a Reynolds so much that she preferred to live in poverty than accept dirty money. I wanted to know if there was goodness in this family." "And did you discover?" "I discovered that there is a man in this family who hates the crimes it committed, so much that he isolated himself from the world for 5 years. I discovered a man who blames himself for his sister's death because he loved her too much to accept that he couldn't save her. I discovered the man my great-grandmother had seen and loved, even knowing she could never be with him." The FBI representative, realizing that the personal drama was overshadowing the legal issues, intervened. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask that we focus on the criminal evidence presented. Personal matters can be resolved later." But Austin wasn't finished. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said, taking an envelope from the inside pocket of his suit. "This morning we received information that Miss Carter is pregnant. How far along, miss? 2 weeks, 3? Exactly the period in which you've been romantically involved with my cousin." The world stopped for Isabella. She wasn't pregnant, she was sure of that, but Austin's accusation was made with such conviction that even she began to doubt. And, seeing Ethan's expression, she realized he was calculating dates, remembering the night in the cabin when they finally completely surrendered to each other. "That's not true," she said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Then you won't mind taking a test now." Austin gestured to one of the people in a lab coat he had brought to commit Ethan. "Dr. Santana can confirm immediately." That's when Ethan finally exploded. All the anger, frustration, and pain of the last 5 years came to the surface at once. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "Enough of manipulations, enough of lies, enough of games." He turned to the audience, his hands trembling with adrenaline. "You want the truth? I'll give the complete truth. Yes, My family are criminals. Yes, I participated in some of those crimes when I took over the company, because I was blackmailed and manipulated exactly the same way they're trying to manipulate all of you now." He pointed to Austin. "And yes, Isabella may have lied about some details of how she came into my life. But you know what else? I don't care. Because in the last 2 months she has shown me more emotional honesty, more courage, more true love than my entire family has shown me in 42 years of life." Ethan walked to Isabella and held her trembling hands between his. "Are you pregnant?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't think so, but it's possible." "And if you are?" "If I am, it will be the most loved baby in the world, because it will be ours." He kissed her then, there in front of that entire audience, journalists, authorities, and family. A kiss that tasted of forgiveness, of acceptance, of the conscious choice to love despite imperfections and secrets. When they separated, he turned again to Austin. "You won, cousin. Take the company. Do what you want with it. But know that, as long as I live, I'll fight against every crime you commit. And now I have the press, the authorities, and an extraordinary woman on my side." The FBI representative stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Austin Reynolds, based on the evidence presented today, you're under arrest for formation of a criminal organization, aggravated homicide, and a list of other crimes that will take years to process completely." The next minutes were a chaos of handcuffs, rights being read, journalists shouting questions, and members of the Reynolds family being escorted out of the building. But in the midst of all that confusion, Ethan and Isabella remained together, holding hands, observing a world they had helped change forever. 6 months later, they married in a simple ceremony in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, with the presence of Isabella's aunts, Detective Cardenas, and the journalist Helena Vega, who had become a close friend. Isabella wasn't pregnant, but both agreed there was no hurry. They had a whole life ahead to build the family they wanted. Ethan sold all his shares of Reynolds Pharmaceuticals to an international human rights consortium and used the money to create a foundation that offered free medical treatment for vulnerable communities, exactly the communities his family had exploited for decades. Isabella used her great-grandmother's inheritance to open a dance school in Aspen, at the same location where the cabin stood where they fell in love. Every night, after the students left, she and Ethan danced alone in the main studio, to the sound of old waltzes and melancholy fados that played on the same old radio they had saved from the mansion. There were no hidden cameras. There were no secrets between them. There were only two hearts that had found in love the courage to face any storm, and who now danced free for as long as life allowed. On the studio wall, in a simple frame, was a photograph of Lily Reynolds, dancing, the only image of her smiling that Ethan had managed to find, and beside it, a photo of Elizabeth Monroe Everett, young and beautiful, also dancing. Two women who had died too young, but whose legacy of love had finally found a way to flourish through those who remained. And every night before turning off the studio lights, Isabella